The pain in my ribs was a sharp, insistent thing, a dull throb with every shallow breath I dared to take. As I carefully lowered myself into the dining chair, the wood creaking in protest, my daughter-in-law Nora shot me a look that was pure poison, so quickly masked by a saccharine smile that I almost thought I'd imagined it. She turned her dazzling smile on the assembled family, her voice a perfect, practiced melody of warmth. "A toast to Katharina," she announced, raising her glass of cheap sparkling wine, her voice just a little too loud, still as tough as ever, even after that nasty fall down the cottage stairs, a true survivor. Her grin was all teeth, a predator's bearing. Guess the old girl learned her lesson about wandering around in the dark, but smiled back, a thin, neutral stretch of my lips that didn't reach my eyes. Let her think I was a frail, confused old woman. Let her believe her clever little plan had worked, that she had gotten away with it. Because what Nora, in her arrogant desperation, didn't know was that I hadn't fallen down those stairs at all. I had been pushed, and I had the proof. But I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? Let me start at the beginning, 3 weeks earlier, when this whole long, ugly nightmare began. My name is Katharina Williams. I'm 75 years old, and for the better part of my life, 30 years to be exact, I was an investigator for a major insurance firm in Toronto. Not a cop, mind you. I didn't carry a gun or chase down suspects in dark alleys. My battlefield was paper. My weapons were spreadsheets and a deep, unnerving understanding of greed. I specialized in fraud, the high-value kind. I'd seen it all: arson for profit, staged slip-and-falls, complex schemes involving phantom beneficiaries, and forged documents. I'd stared into the cold, dead eyes of people who would sell their own grandmother for a payout, and I'd built the cases that put them away. I thought retirement, 15 years ago now, would mean peace, quiet mornings tending to my late husband David's prize-winning roses, maybe a trip to the library, the gentle hum of a life well lived. David passed 5 years ago. A sudden, massive heart attack while he was out raking leaves one autumn afternoon. One moment he was here, the next he was gone. After that, our son Thomas and his family became my entire world. He was our only child, a good, kind man, a software developer with a gentle soul in his father's warm eyes. When he married Nora 7 years ago, I'd had my reservations. The woman was all surface, a whirlwind of expensive perfume, designer labels, and ambitious talk. She was a life coach and entrepreneur, though her businesses seemed to be as ethereal as smoke, always just on the verge of a massive breakthrough that never quite materialized. But Thomas loved her, or thought he did, and he was so happy. I kept my concerns to myself, burying them under a mountain of hope for my son's happiness. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We bite our tongues and pray for the best. It was early December when the call came. I was in my sunroom, surrounded by David's orchids, trying to coax a stubborn phalaenopsis into bloom. The scent of damp earth and fertilizer filled the air, a smell that usually brought me comfort. But today it just felt like another reminder of his absence. My phone buzzed on the small table beside me, and Nora's face, perfectly framed and filtered, filled the screen. "Katharina, how are you?" she chirped, her voice a few octaves too cheerful. "I'm well, Nora, just enjoying my plants. What can I do for you?" "Well, Thomas and I were talking, and we realized you haven't been up to the cottage since, well, you know." Her voice dropped into a passable imitation of sympathy. "We thought it would be so good for you to get away, just the three of us. A weekend at the lake, away from the city, some quality time before the Christmas rush. What do you think?" The cottage, the word landed like a stone in my stomach. David and I had built it 30 years ago on the shores of Lake Muskoka, a 2-hour drive north of the city. It was our sanctuary, the place where we'd dreamed of growing old together. I hadn't been back since he died. The memories there were too vivid, too painful. The ghost of his laughter in the living room, the worn spot on the dock where he used to sit with his morning coffee. It was all too much. "I don't know, Nora," I said slowly, my investigator's brain already worried. "It's winter. The roads can be treacherous, and the cottage isn't really set up for the cold. Oh, I've already thought of that, she said, a little too quickly. Thomas had the hydro company turn on the heat remotely last week, and he's been checking on the place. Everything is perfect. It'll be good for you, Katharina. You've been cooped up in that big house all alone for too long, please. There was something in her voice, a strained, brittle quality, that wasn't quite desperation, but was circling it. I wondered if they were having money trouble again. Maybe she wanted neutral ground to ask for a loan, a scenario that had played out more than once. My mind flashed back to a dinner a few months prior where Nora had casually mentioned a can't-miss crypto opportunity. I had shut it down then, and Thomas had been quiet for days, caught between his mother's caution and his wife's ambition. Was this another attempt? All right, I heard myself say, my investigator's brain filing away the inconsistencies. The sudden interest in the cottage, the convenient illness, the pressure. It was a pattern I'd seen 100 times. When were you thinking? This coming weekend. We could drive up Friday afternoon, stay through Sunday. I'll even make David's famous tertiary. That sealed it. David's tertiary, a rich, savory meat pie, was a family tradition, a taste of home I hadn't experienced in years. The offer was a carefully crafted key, designed to unlock the door to my resistance. Okay, Nora, count me in. Perfect. Thomas will pick you up Friday at 2. Love you, Katharina. Love you too, dear, I replied, the words feeling foreign and hollow on my tongue. I hung up, but a cold knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Maybe it was 30 years of instinct sniffing out a bad risk, or maybe it was just grief making me paranoid. But Nora, who had always complained the cottage was too rustic and boring, suddenly taking the initiative to prepare it seemed odd. Thomas, too. He knew how hard it was for me to go there. I pushed the thought aside. Maybe, after all this time, they were genuinely trying to reach out, to help me heal. I had to believe that. For Thomas. Friday arrived cold and gray, a typical Ontario December day. The sky was a low, heavy ceiling of cloud, and a fine powdery snow was beginning to fall, dusting the bare branches of the maple trees in my yard. I packed a small bag with a warm sweater, my book, and the medication for the arthritis that had taken up residence in my joints since David's death. At 2 o'clock sharp, Thomas's new SUV, a gleaming black monstrosity they definitely couldn't afford, pulled into my driveway. But he wasn't alone. Nora was in the passenger seat, her smile stretched tight across her face. Where's Thomas? I asked, climbing into the back seat, the leather cold against my coat. Change of plans, Nora said, her eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. He's come down with that awful flu that's going around, burning up. I made him stay in bed. The last thing he needs is to be trudging through the snow. She was a good liar. I had to give her that. Her voice was laced with just the right amount of wifely concern. Should we wait until he's better? I really don't mind. No, absolutely not, she insisted, pulling back onto the street, the tires crunching on the fresh snow. He insisted we go ahead. Said he didn't want us to ruin the weekend on his account. You know how he is, always a martyr. Besides, it'll be a nice chance for us to have some girl time. Just the two of us. There was an edge to her voice when she said that, a challenge. We drove in silence for the first hour. The landscape outside the window transitioned from suburban sprawl to the dense, snow-dusted forests of cottage country. The bare maples and pines stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with white. Nora seemed tense, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her eyes constantly flicking to the mirrors. I tried to make conversation. How is the life coaching business? Busy, she said, her gaze fixed on the road. Always busy. I'm launching a new online seminar series. It's going to be huge. That's wonderful. More silence. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the swish of the windshield wipers. Then, actually, Katharina, she began, her tone shifting to one of conspiratorial excitement. I wanted to talk to you about something. Here it comes, I thought. The pitch for money. You know Thomas's software development. He's been working on something new, a real game changer for the logistics industry. We're on the verge of securing some major venture capital, but we need a bridge loan to get us over the finish line. A small investment, really, to get a stake in the company. The returns could be astronomical. I'd heard that pitch before, 1,000 times, in 1,000 different forms. It was the siren song of every fraud artist I'd ever investigated. How much are we talking about? I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. Well, to get a decent founding partner stake, probably around 250,000, she said, as if she were discussing the price of groceries. But like I said, the returns would be incredible. 40, maybe 50% annually, guaranteed. No legitimate investment guarantees those kinds of returns. It's the first rule of finance. Let me think about it, I said. Nora's jaw tightened, a tiny movement I caught in the rearview mirror, but her smile remained plastered on her face. Of course, but we'd need to know soon. This opportunity won't wait forever. We turned off the highway onto the gravel road that led to the cottage. The trees, heavy with snow, closed in around us, blocking out the late afternoon sun. The world went quiet, muffled by the blanket of white. Nora drove too fast for the road conditions, the SUV's tires crunching and slipping on the patches of black ice beneath the fresh snow. Easy, Nora, I said, a hand instinctively going to the door handle. No need to rush. She didn't slow down. We arrived at the cottage as darkness fell completely. It looked smaller than I remembered, more isolated. The nearest neighbor was a good 2 kilometers away. There was no cell service out here, a fact David had always loved. We'd installed a landline years ago for emergencies, but I hadn't checked if it was still active. Nora grabbed our bags from the back. I'll get these inside. Why don't you go and start a fire? It's probably a bit chilly in there. The cottage was freezing, a bitter, penetrating cold that seeped right into my bones. Despite Nora's claims about the hydro being on, my breath plumed in the air in front of me. I found the thermostat and cranked it up, the furnace remaining silent. I moved to the fireplace. The wood bin beside the hearth was empty. Nora, we need to get some firewood from the shed, I called out. I'll do it in a minute, she replied, her voice muffled from the back bedroom. Just let me get organized. I heard her then, the low murmur of her voice on the phone, probably getting the last of her signal from the main road. The tone was urgent, clipped. Pulling on my coat and boots, I went outside to get the wood myself. The air was sharp and clean, smelling of pine and frozen earth. The shed was around the back of the cottage, accessible by a set of wooden stairs that led down from the raised deck. The stairs were old, weathered by years of harsh Muskoka winters. David had always said we needed to replace them, but we never got around to it. I loaded my arms with logs from the shed and started back up. That's when I saw it. The second step from the top had been deliberately sawed, partway through, the cut cleverly hidden by a thin layer of fresh snow. It was a clean, precise cut. If someone put their full weight on it, it would snap without warning, sending them tumbling forward onto the frozen ground, 2 meters below. My blood ran cold, and it had nothing to do with the temperature. I knelt down, my old joints protesting, and examined the cut more closely, brushing away the snow. Fresh sawdust clung to my glove. This hadn't been done by accident or by rot. This had been done recently. Within the last few hours, my mind, the old well-oiled machine that had never really retired, started to connect the dots. The sudden trip, Thomas's convenient illness, the lies about the heat, the pressure for money. A pattern was forming, and it was a terrifying one. I carefully stepped over the damaged stair and went back inside. Nora was in the kitchen, pulling items from a cooler, her back to me. Found the problem with the stairs, I said, my voice calm, as if I were commenting on the weather. The second step is rotted clean through. Almost took a nasty fall. We'll have to be careful. Her shoulders tensed for just a fraction of a second, a tell so subtle anyone else would have missed it. She turned around, her expression a perfect mask of concern. Oh, my goodness, that's dangerous. Good thing you noticed. I'll take a look at it tomorrow in the daylight, see if we can fix it. She was good. I'd interrogated hundreds of people in my career, and Nora's poker face was impressive. But there was a flicker in her eyes, a moment of pure, cold calculation. She was lying. Yes, I said slowly, my gaze unwavering. Good thing, but it wasn't good at all. It was the beginning of the end. And I was trapped in a cabin in the middle of nowhere with a woman who had just tried to kill me. That night, I barely slept. I lay in the bedroom David and I had shared, staring at the shadowed ceiling, my mind racing like a hamster on a wheel. Every creak of the cabin, every whistle of the wind through the eaves, sounded like a footstep on the stairs. The sod step, Nora's lies. The cut phone line I found after she went to bed. The cord severed cleanly behind the heavy oak desk. A neat, professional job. Another accident. This wasn't about a bridge loan. This was about elimination. The cold was a physical presence now, seeping through the blankets, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. I thought of my son, Thomas. Did he know? Was he a part of this? The thought was a physical blow, a pain worse than the cold, worse than my aching joints. I replayed our last conversation before I left. He had seemed distant, tired, but he was always tired with his work. I couldn't believe it. Thomas was weak, easily led, but he wasn't a monster. He was my son. He had David's kind eyes. This had Nora's fingerprints all over it. The greed, the desperation, the cold, calculated cruelty. I had to believe he was another one of her victims. I had to. For my own sanity, I clung to that belief. The night stretched on, an eternity of darkness and fear. I didn't dare sleep, not really. I just dozed, drifting in and out of a haze of anxiety, my hand never far from the heavy glass on the bedside table. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Nora humming off-key. I pushed myself out of bed, every muscle protesting. I found her in the kitchen, a pot of coffee brewing, her back to me. She seemed cheerful, almost manic, a stark contrast to the terror that had been my companion all night. "Morning, Katharina. Sleep well?" she asked, turning around with a bright, brittle smile. "Well enough," I said, my voice hoarse. "When is Thomas supposed to get here?" I had to ask, had to keep up the pretense. She sighed dramatically, stirring her coffee, the spoon clinking against the mug with an exaggerated sound. "He texted me. He's feeling even worse. His mother is going to go over and stay with him. He won't make it up at all. He's so sorry to ruin our girl time." She was lying. I could feel it in my bones. Thomas adored his mother. He would never let her go alone if he were truly sick. And his mother was my sister, Margaret. She would have called me. The lie was clumsy, transparent, but delivered with such conviction, it was chilling. "Well, that's a shame," I said, my voice flat, betraying none of the storm raging inside me. I moved to the counter to pour myself a coffee, my hands steady. I had to be steady. "I thought maybe you and I could do some skating on the lake," Nora said, her smile a little too bright, her eyes watching me over the rim of her mug. The ice should be perfect. Ice skating on a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere with a woman I was now certain wanted me dead. The suggestion was so absurd it was almost funny. "Maybe later," I said, turning to face her. "My arthritis is acting up a bit. Think I'll just relax here with my book." Nora's smile tightened, the first real crack in her facade. "Oh, come on, Katharina, don't be boring. David wouldn't want you moping around like an old woman." The mention of my husband's name, in that context, made my jaw clench, a hot flash of anger rising in my chest. But I kept my voice even, my face a mask of calm indifference. I said, "Maybe later." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken threats. We were no longer pretending. We were just waiting. After a silent, tense breakfast, where we pushed scrambled eggs around our plates without eating, Nora announced she was going into the small town nearby for supplies. "We're low on a few things. Should only take an hour or so. You'll be okay here alone." Her tone was taunting, as if she knew I was trapped and wanted to revel in my fear. "I've been taking care of myself for 75 years, Nora," I said, my voice dry as dust, not looking up from my book. "I think I'll manage." The moment her SUV disappeared down the road, its red taillights quickly swallowed by the gray woods, I moved. There was no time to waste. I went to work with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. First, the bedroom. I went through her bag in the spare room. I was methodical. I didn't just dump it out. I carefully removed each item, noting the expensive brands, the tags still on some things she clearly couldn't afford. It was a performance of wealth, a costume for a role she was desperate to play. Buried under a pile of expensive-looking clothes, I found a folder. It was a plain manila folder, the kind you'd get from an office supply store, and it felt heavy with consequence. Inside were documents that made my stomach drop. Foreclosure notices on their house, letters from collection agencies, dozens of them, their language growing more urgent and threatening with each page. Credit card statements with balances in the tens of thousands, the minimum payments barely making a dent, and then casino cash advance receipts, so many of them, from different places, totaling nearly $100,000. It wasn't a failed business venture. It was a gambling addiction, a black hole of debt that had swallowed everything. At the bottom of the folder, I found something that turned my blood to ice. Life insurance documents, mine. A policy David and I had taken out 30 years ago, worth $500,000. The beneficiary had originally been David, then Thomas after he passed. But according to these new documents, the beneficiary had been changed 3 months ago, to Nora. My hands shook as I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. The motive, cold, clear, and utterly monstrous. I needed more. Something undeniable. Something that connected her directly to the attempt. I went outside, the cold air a shock to my system. I examined the stairs again in the crisp morning light. Using my phone, I took detailed photos of the cut, the fresh sawdust, the placement of the step, making sure to include a ruler from my sewing kit for scale. Then, I checked the woodshed. The lock had been forced, the wood around it splintered, the marks fresh. She hadn't used the saw from the garage, she'd brought her own. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was premeditated, meticulously planned. I went back inside, my mind a whirlwind of calculations, of building a case in my head, just like I used to at the firm. When Nora returned, her SUV crunching on the gravel, I was sitting by the fire, my book in my lap, the very picture of a calm grandmother, the fire now crackling merrily. "Hey Katharina, got everything we need for a cozy weekend," she said, her voice overly bright as she brought in bags of groceries. "Now, how about that skating?" "Actually," I said, closing my book and marking my page with a deliberate slowness, "I was thinking about your investment opportunity. Tell me more about Thomas's new software." Her face lit up, a predator seeing a lamb finally wander into the trap. For the next hour, she pitched her fantasy, showing me glossy mock-ups on her phone, talking about projected market shares and disruptive technologies. It was all nonsense, of course. I'd seen the foreclosure notices. There was no software. There was only a mountain of debt. "So, what do you think?" she finally asked, her eyes gleaming with a greedy light. "I think I need to see the business plan, the code, the financial projections," I said, my voice calm and reasonable. "You understand, Nora, I'm a careful woman. I didn't build my retirement by making rash decisions." The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Nora's smile vanished completely, replaced by a cold, hard mask. "There isn't time for all that. I told you, this opportunity won't last." "Then, I guess it's not meant to be," I said softly, turning back to my book. She stood up slowly, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "You never liked me, did you, Katharina? Never thought I was good enough for your precious Thomas. This isn't about that. Shut up," she shrieked, her voice echoing in the small cabin, the veneer of civility shattering completely. "I'm talking now. You sit there in your big house, judging everyone, with your perfect little life and your dead husband. You think you're so superior, but you're just a washed-up old woman who couldn't even keep her husband alive." The blow struck deep, as it was meant to, a low, dirty hit designed to hurt. but I kept my face impassive. I think you should leave, Nora. Leave. She laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. We're in the middle of nowhere. It's my truck, and you're not going anywhere. Her smile returned, but it was a terrifying, feral thing. Besides, we haven't finished our conversation about the investment. See, I really need that money, and one way or another, I'm going to get it. She moved toward me then, a purposeful, predatory stride. I stood, positioning myself between her and the hearth, my body tense. I might have been 75, but I wasn't helpless. This is your last chance, Nora. Leave now. Thomas isn't coming, she hissed, her face contorted with rage. I told him not to. I told him we needed some bonding time, me and his mother. He thinks we're having a lovely weekend. So, what's your plan, old woman? Call the police. She pulled my phone from her pocket, waving it in the air like a trophy. Oops, must have fallen out of your purse. No signal here, anyway. She rushed me then. I sidestepped, using her own momentum against her, and she crashed into the coffee table, sending a lamp crashing to the floor. But she was younger, stronger, and fueled by a desperate, manic rage. She recovered and came at me again, shoving me hard in the chest. I fell backwards, striking my ribs against the sharp edge of the stone hearth. A blinding white-hot pain exploded through my side, and I heard a sickening crack. I went down, gasping for air, and she was on me in an instant, her hands around my throat, squeezing. Black spots danced in my vision. This was it. This was how it ended. Murdered by my son's wife in the cabin I had built with my husband. But then, through the fog of oxygen deprivation, I remembered something. Not a gun. I didn't have a gun. But on the mantelpiece, right above my head, was the heavy cast-iron poker David had used to tend the fire. With the last of my strength, I bucked my hips, throwing her off balance for a second. It was all I needed. I grabbed the poker. It's cold, heavy iron, a lifeline. I swung it wildly, not to hit her, but to create space. The iron bar connected with the side of her knee with a sickening thud. She screamed, a high-pitched sound of pain and shock, and released her grip, stumbling backwards. I scrambled away, gasping, my throat burning, my ribs screaming in agony. I pointed the poker at her, my hand shaking but my voice steady. Get back. She stared at the poker, then at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fury. You wouldn't dare. Try me, I wheezed. Self-defense is a powerful defense, Nora. And you'd be surprised what a woman with nothing left to lose is willing to do. I gestured toward the armchair with the poker. Sit now, she complied, her face a mask of hatred and defeat. While I kept the poker trained on her, I used my belt and the curtain's tiebacks to secure her wrists to the chair arms. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. You can't prove anything, she spat, her voice trembling with rage. But her eyes were filled with fear. I pulled out my phone. Oh, but I can, I said, my voice cold as the winter air outside. I showed her the photos of the sod step, plus, the documents in your bag. The forged signature on the life insurance policy. That's fraud, Nora, and combined with the assault and attempted murder, the charges are going to stick. Her face crumpled, the tough facade dissolving into a pathetic, weeping mess. The debts just kept growing, she sobbed. I thought if I could just get access to some capital, I could win it all back. I love Thomas, Katharina. I do, but I got in too deep, so you decided to kill me. I needed that insurance money. After you were gone, I was going to take care of Thomas. I swear, it would have been enough to cover everything and still have left over for him. You would have bankrupted my son trying to save yourself, I said, my voice filled with a cold disgust. She said nothing, because we both knew it was true. We sat in silence as the sun set and the temperature in the cabin dropped. I didn't dare leave to get more firewood. The cold began to seep in, a physical manifestation of the chilling silence between us. Then, through the window, I saw it. Headlights, cutting through the deepening twilight. My heart leaped into my throat. Who was it? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The door to the cabin creaked open, and my son, Thomas, stood there on the threshold, his face pale in the gloom, shivering not just from the cold. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene instantly. Me, bruised and bleeding, leaning against the hearth for support, still holding the heavy fire poker like a weapon. Nora, tied to a chair in the center of the room, her face a mask of tear-streaked shock and fury. The destruction of the coffee table, the shattered lamp. It was a tableau of violence, a domestic horror story. His face went from pale to a ghostly white, the blood draining from it. "Mom, what happened? What did you do?" he asked, his voice a confused, horrified whisper, his eyes fixed on the poker in my hand. "Not what I did, Thomas," I said, my voice breaking with a relief so profound it almost buckled my knees. "What she did." I carefully set the poker down, its clatter against the stone hearth loud in the suffocating silence. I pushed myself away from the wall, every movement an agony of fire in my side. I quickly explained everything, my voice hoarse but clear. The sawed step, the forged documents, the cut phone line, the attack. With each word, each piece of the terrible puzzle, I watched my son's face transform from confusion to dawning horror, and finally, to a crushing soul-deep grief that seemed to age him 10 years in as many minutes. He looked at Nora, then back at me, as if trying to reconcile the two realities, the woman he thought he loved, with the monster I was describing. When I finished, a single tear traced a path down his cheek. He turned slowly, as if his neck were made of stone, to face Nora. His voice was a broken whisper. "Is it true?" She couldn't meet his eyes, her gaze fixed on the floor, a trapped animal finally cornered. "Tom, I can explain. Is it true?" he repeated, his voice rising, cracking with a pain so raw it was unbearable to witness. "I was desperate. I made mistakes. But I did it for us. For our future. You tried to kill my mother," he said, his voice filled with a disbelief so profound it was almost worse than anger. It was the sound of a world shattering. "How? How is that for us?" He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. "I'm calling the police." "No signal here," I reminded him, my own voice barely a whisper. "The landline is cut." "We'll drive," he said, his voice hardening. The softness of my son being replaced by a man I barely recognized, a man forged in betrayal. He looked at Nora one last time, and I saw his heart break in real time, a clean, sharp fracture. Then he turned to me, his eyes filled with a fierce, protective love. "Let's go, Mom. We'll take my car. She can stay here and think about what she's done." We left Nora tied to that chair, a sobbing, pathetic figure in the center of the ruin she had created. We didn't look back. The drive was a blur of white snow and black trees. Thomas drove with a rigid, controlled fury, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I sat in the passenger seat, cradling my ribs, each breath a shallow, sharp agony. We drove 20 minutes down the road, the SUV's headlights cutting a swath through the darkness, until a single bar appeared on my phone. "Cell service." He pulled over onto the shoulder, the tires crunching on the gravel, and called the OPP. His voice was steady as he gave the dispatcher our location, a concise, emotionless report of an attempted murder and an assault. When he hung up, he finally broke, leaning his forehead against the steering wheel, his body shaking with silent, racking sobs. I reached over and put a hand on his back, my own tears finally falling, mingling our grief and our relief. Constable Miller, a young officer with a kind, weary face, met us at the local detachment. He took one look at me and called for an ambulance, but I refused. "I need to give my statement first," I insisted. So, in a sterile, brightly lit room, with a styrofoam cup of bad coffee warming my hands, I gave my statement. I showed him the evidence on my phone, the photos of the cut, the forged documents I had memorized. I told him where to find the folder in Nora's bag. They arrested her at the cabin 3 hours later. The charges were overwhelming: attempted murder, fraud, forgery, assault causing bodily harm. The evidence was a mountain she could never hope to climb. The doctor at the hospital confirmed 3 cracked ribs, severe bruising, and ligature marks on my throat. All documented. All undeniable. Which brings me back to the Christmas dinner table. 3 weeks after that nightmare weekend, the broken ribs Nora had given me were still healing, a constant, throbbing reminder of her betrayal with every breath I took. But I had insisted on hosting the family dinner. Thomas deserved some semblance of normalcy after everything he had been through. He was a ghost in his own life, moving through his days with a quiet, wounded dignity. Nora, of course, was out on bail pending trial. Her lawyer, a slick-talking man in a suit too expensive for a small town, had somehow convinced the judge she wasn't a flight risk. And somehow, my son, in a misguided attempt at finality, had allowed her to come. For closure, he'd said, his voice hollow, I need to face her, with my family around me. I need to see her in our world, not just in a courtroom. I had argued against it, my every instinct screaming that it was a mistake, but he was my son, and he was hurting, so I had agreed. Now, sitting at my dining table with my cracked ribs, screaming, I watched Nora play the role of the misunderstood victim. She was dressed in a tasteful, understated wool dress, a picture of wounded innocence. My younger brother, his wife, and a few cousins sat stiffly, their smiles strained, unsure how to react. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, a palpable cloud of unspoken history. So, Katharina, Nora said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, a drop of poison in a glass of wine. Now that you've had some time to think about it, realized it was all just a big misunderstanding. When are you going to drop those charges? I mean, we're family, right? The table went silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Everyone stared at me. I carefully set down my fork, the movement sending sharp pains through my side. I looked Nora directly in the eye, my gaze level and cold. A misunderstanding. Is that what you're calling attempted murder now? Mom, please, Thomas started, his voice a pained whisper. But I held up a hand. No, sweetheart. Let me say this. I turned back to Nora, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. You sawed through the cottage stairs, planning for me to fall and break my neck. You cut the landline so I couldn't call for help. You forged my signature to change my life insurance beneficiary. And when none of that worked fast enough, you put your hands around my throat and tried to choke me to death. Nora's mask slipped completely, the saccharine smile dissolving into a sneer of pure hatred. You can't prove the OPP has photos, documents, your fingerprints on the saw you brought, and I have these. I carefully, painfully pulled up my shirt, revealing the massive purple and yellow bruising that covered my side and chest, a grotesque map of her violence. 3 cracked ribs, severe contusions, ligature marks on my throat. All documented by the hospital the night you attacked me. I lowered my shirt and leaned forward, ignoring the searing pain. You didn't teach me a lesson, Nora. You didn't prove I was old and weak and in your way. You proved something else entirely. What's that? She asked, her voice a venomous whisper. That you're a coward who tried to murder an unarmed 75-year-old woman for insurance money. And you still failed. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas was crying quietly, his shoulders shaking. My brother looked like he wanted to vault across the table and strangle Nora himself. Nora stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. I don't have to sit here and take this abuse. Thomas, we're leaving. No, Nora. Thomas said quietly, his voice clear and firm for the first time all night. He looked up at her, his eyes red but his gaze steady. No, you're leaving alone. The divorce papers were served yesterday. My lawyer says with the criminal charges, I'll get everything, the house, the car, all of it. You're going to prison, and when you get out, you'll have nothing. No husband, no family, no future. Get out of my mother's house. Nora looked around the table, seeking an ally, finding none. Finally, her face contorted into a mask of pure, impotent rage. You're all going to regret this. I'll appeal. I'll fight. You'll go to prison, I said calmly. The Crown prosecutor tells me you're looking at 10 to 15 years minimum. And in Canadian prisons, they don't look kindly on women who hurt the elderly. You'll have a lot of time to think about your choices. She stared at me with pure hatred, then stormed out. We heard her car start, tires spinning on the icy driveway as she sped away. After a moment, my brother raised his glass. "To Katharina," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Tough as nails." "To Mom," Thomas added, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." "Nothing to be sorry for, sweetheart," I said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "You loved the wrong woman. That's not a crime. But you chose right in the end, and that's what matters." The rest of our guests left soon after, their goodbyes tinged with a mixture of relief and lingering shock. The house felt cavernous and quiet once they were gone, only the sound of the dishwasher humming in the kitchen. Thomas stayed behind, helping me clear the table with a slow, careful gentleness, as if he were afraid I might break. We worked in a comfortable silence for a while, the kind that only exists between people who have been through a fire together. When the last dish was put away, he didn't leave. He just stood there, his hands in his pockets, looking lost. "I keep thinking about what you said," he finally said, his voice low, "about me choosing right. In the end." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not just the pain, but the strength beginning to return to his eyes. "You did, Thomas. You stood up to her. You protected me. You protected yourself. That's what matters." He nodded, but his gaze was fixed on the floor. "I just feel so stupid. So blind. All those signs." "She was a professional, Thomas," I said, my voice firm. "A con artist. They spend their whole lives learning how to be convincing. They prey on good people, on people who want to believe the best in others. You're not stupid for being a victim of that. You're human." He finally looked up, and a small, fragile smile touched his lips. "Thanks, Mom." We stood there for a while longer, a mother and her son, survivors of a war we never saw coming. Nora's trial was set for the spring. The evidence was so overwhelming, a mountain of proof she couldn't possibly scale, that her lawyer began hinting at a plea deal almost immediately. In the end, she took it. To avoid a trial, to avoid the public spectacle of her crimes being laid bare, she pleaded guilty to all charges. The judge, a stern woman with no patience for such betrayals, sentenced her to 12 years in a federal prison. 12 years. It was a number, a concrete measure of justice, but it felt abstract, distant. The real justice was quieter. It was in the way Thomas started to laugh again, a real, genuine laugh that I hadn't heard in months. It was in the peaceful silence of my house, no longer filled with the dread of her next call or her next visit. I sold the cottage. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. David and I had built it with our own hands, with dreams and sweat and so much love. Every room held a memory. But now, layered over the good memories were the bad ones. The chill of her lies, the sight of the sod step, the feel of her hands around my throat. I couldn't go back there. It was no longer our sanctuary. It was a crime scene. So I sold it to a young family with 3 kids, full of noise and life, and I hoped they could fill it with new/happy memories that would overwrite the stain she had left. The money, every last cent, went into a trust for Thomas, to help him rebuild his life, free from the debt she had tried to tie to my death. My ribs healed slowly. At my age, everything heals slower. Each deep breath was a reminder, a dull ache that was finally fading. I started volunteering at a local community center, running a workshop I called Street Smarts for seniors. I taught them how to spot phishing emails, how to recognize a phone scam, how to say no to a high-pressure pitch. "Don't be a victim," I told them, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "Stay aware, stay strong, and trust your gut. If a deal sounds too good to be true, it is." If my terrible experience could help even one person avoid a similar situation, then maybe something good had come from it all. Thomas was doing better, too. He was in therapy, working through the complicated web of betrayal and guilt. He kept apologizing, but I kept telling him the same thing. "You didn't do this, Thomas. Nora did. You're a victim here, too." He was starting to believe it. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is still and the only light comes from the moon on the snow in the backyard, I think about those moments on the cottage floor. I think about Nora's hands around my throat, my vision fading to black. I think about how close I came, how a few more seconds would have meant I never saw another sunrise, never held a grandchild, never watched my son heal and find happiness again. And then, I think about David. I imagine his voice in my head, that warm, practical tone he always used when I was overthinking things, worrying about nothing. "You survived, Kath," he'd say. "Now stop dwelling and start living." So that's what I'm doing. I'm living. One careful, deep breath at a time. My cracked ribs are a memory, but the lesson they taught me remains. I'm still here, still fighting, still refusing to let anyone else write the ending to my story. Nora thought she could get away with murder. Instead, she's getting 12 years in a federal prison. A criminal record that will follow her for the rest of her life, and the crushing knowledge that she tried to kill an old woman and failed completely. That's justice. Canadian justice. Slow, thorough, and absolutely certain. And for me, I got something more valuable than revenge. I got my life back. I got my son, truly got him back, free from her poison. And I have the quiet satisfaction of knowing that experience, training, and a sheer, stubborn refusal to give up can still win the day. Even when you're 75 with a broken heart and a body that aches, you can still win. You just have to be smart about it. You have to stay calm under pressure, and you can never, ever underestimate what an old fraud investigator knows about catching a liar. Nora learned that lesson the hard way, and she have 12 long years to remember it. As for that toast she made at Christmas dinner about the old woman learning her lesson, she was right about one thing. Someone learned a lesson that weekend at the cottage. It just wasn't me. If Katharina's story of strength and resilience hit home for you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful stories. Your comments and support help us bring these important narratives to life and reach more people. Thank you so much for watching.